evening, everybody. All right. Welcome to Ormond College, for those who are new here. Thank you all for coming out tonight to this great event. I'd like to begin tonight's proceedings by acknowledging that we are gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. For tens of thousands of years, this land has been a place both of discussion and care for country, important pursuits that tonight's event will engage with. A lot can be learnt from the dialogue principles of First Nations people, such as the idea of walking together, moving between physical environments to break negative tension, or the concept of Dadiri, which is promoted by Indigenous elder and educator, Dr. Miriam Rose Ungunmer Bowman. This refers to a practice of deep listening with calm and stillness, which seems like a pertinent idea to reflect upon during tonight's discussion. I'm Abby Ralph, your MC for tonight. I'm a second-year Bachelor of Arts student at Melbourne University studying history, English and French, and I'm part of the Sustainability Committee at Ormond College. As a history student and someone who cares deeply about the environment, I feel really privileged to be involved tonight in this sustainability dialogue at a pivotal moment in Australia's environmental decision-making. Today's discussion will revolve specifically around the equity considerations of Australia's movement towards renewable energy. In an effort to achieve a more sustainable future, Australia is currently undergoing a major transition towards cleaner energy. Limited public discussion has taken place, however, around the equity implications of this transition for different industries and geographical and socio-economic groups. Tonight's discussion event, presented by Ormond College in association with Australian Dialogues, is the third in an informal series of big dialogues on energy transition, and the very first held on any university campus. The conversation will address questions such as whether the energy transition benefits everyone or only certain socio-political groups. Can it be just and fair, and if so, how? The Australian Dialogues, emerging from the Brisbane Dialogues, is the country's first dedicated civil discourse organisation, with the mission of supporting other organisations to conduct in-depth bridging discussions on big ideas and issues, particularly contentious ones. It is a wholly independent, intergenerational, non-partisan and volunteer-based not-for-profit community project. The Big Dialogues have been running for over 5 years at the Tivoli and Princess Theatres in Brisbane, and collaborations continue to grow, with Big Dialogue events having now also been held in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. Australian Dialogues seeks to unite people from differing ideological standpoints and demonstrate the possibility and power of not only civil but productive and enlightening public discussions between individuals with diverse or even opposing views, modelling and inspiring better discussion practice in the public sphere. With this aim in mind, today's conversation will be carried out in accordance with the Brisbane Rule, which was created at the launch of the Dialogues. It is a variation of the Chatham House Rule, which has been adapted for public events in the digital age, and reads, all participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussion, not on characters, before, during, and afterwards, online as well as offline. This includes guests, not just speakers. Moving on to a few thank yous now. On behalf of Ormond College, I'd like to thank some of the many people who have contributed to tonight's event. Most importantly, thank you to our speakers, who we're extremely grateful to for volunteering substantial time on top of their regular workloads to be here tonight. Thanks are also due to premium ticket holders, those who donated tickets, and particularly the buyers of Masters tables, who are Peter Cooper, Charles Kiefel, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and Growth Point Limited. Their support enables our inclusive ticket pricing and keeps the Big Dialogue series viable and growing. A big thank you also to Australian Dialogues for their partnership, particularly Murray Hancock, co-founder of Brisbane Dialogues, and to Ormond College for hosting this event, especially to Sophie Simpson and Ari Matuamate, who have been vital in facilitating this event. Ari was hoping to moderate tonight's dialogue, but has unfortunately fallen ill. So a sincere thanks to our academic advisor, James Brown, who has very kindly offered to step in tonight. I also want to acknowledge past Ormondian Stephen Wilson, who spoke at both of the two previous Big Dialogues on energy transition and helped in the background with this one as well. The organisation of tonight's dialogue would not be possible without the serious dedication of Jack Lohman, wherever he is, the head of Ormond's Sustainability Committee, so a huge thanks also to Jack. And last but not least, thank you to all of our student volunteers tonight, as well as to the amazing kitchen team serving us tonight. I've just got a few final housekeeping points. Please keep mobile phones on silent. Toilets are through the vestibule if you need to use them. Male to the right, female to the left. Feel free to come in and out if need be, but please keep separate conversations to a minimum during the discussion. Food will be served shortly, and if you have any dietary requirements, just let the servers know as they come around. At 7:40, our speakers will be introduced and the dialogue will commence. Dessert will be served after about an hour of panel discussion, after which there will be approximately half an hour of Q&A time. Until then, enjoy your dinner and thank you for listening. Hope you guys are all enjoying the food and drinks. Moving on to our dialogue now. Just before we introduce the speakers, we'd like to encourage everyone to text questions throughout the stage discussion to the phone number. It should be all on your tables. So yeah, if you just relevant questions texted via this number with names given, maybe read out throughout the dialogue. And there'll also be time for a few live questions from the floor. You'll also see a link and a QR code to carry on the discussion online after the event on that plaque, but there'll be more to come on that later. It's now time to introduce tonight's speakers. So if you guys would just come up one by one as I introduce you. It is my great pleasure to introduce Gavin Dufty, National Director of Energy Policy and Research at St Vincent de Paul Society, focusing on the challenges faced by disadvantaged and vulnerable households in the energy market and leading research into energy affordability. Thank you, Gavin. Perfect. Zoe Hilton, Senior Policy Analyst at the Centre for Independent Studies, leading bold conversations in the energy program and bringing sharp analysis to national media outlets. Thank you, Zoe. Ross Johns, President of the Wimmera Mallee Environmental and Agricultural Protection Association and farm owner, who's spent decades working in agribusiness finance with clients across the Australian agricultural sector. Thank you, Ross. Emily Sims, Strategic Planner, Think Tanker and Policy Advocate, specialising in housing strategy, land use policy and renewable energy planning and advising at Uralla Shire Council on large-scale renewable projects. Thanks, Emily. I'd also like to introduce our fantastic moderator tonight, James Brown, academic advisor at Ormond College, who brings extensive academic leadership experience at education institutions across Victoria. Thank you, James. All right. Over to you guys.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much all for coming, but in particular, thank you to you guys for not only giving up your time, but risking everything to be here tonight. There's great diversity here, and I would also like to acknowledge the great diversity in the audience. And I think that is likely to be a strength of tonight's discussion, because among us, there are people who throw around energy acronyms like they're oxygen, and there are people among us who scratch our heads at what a kilowatt is. Between us, I think we can reach a very interesting conclusion to an incredibly difficult, complex topic, and one that I think is much more significant than it first appears, partly because we're sitting in Ormond, which, by the way, thank you, Abby, for your welcome to country. This is a building built on the Scottish Enlightenment, and that's about grappling with difficult ideas in a particularly Scottish, no-holds-barred kind of way. So I think that this is an appropriate place for a conversation like this, and I'd like you to be formulating, difficult questions. I'm sorry. Tonight, the Brisbane rules, I hate to say that, Brisbane rules are applicable in Melbourne, but I think that they underpin the nature of this discussion. So we'll open up the floor to questions. There will be people with whom you disagree. I'm really looking forward to a really pleasant but firm disagreement, and let's see if we can come to some really interesting insights by doing that. Could I ask a question for anybody who's willing to answer? The topic tonight is this notion of equity. How does the rollout of renewable energy address questions of equity? Can someone address a definition of equity in this space? I hate that phrase. What does equity look like?
Just to answer, I suppose. Wow, that's a very strong microphone. I would say that equity should be fair between generations, be fair to all parties, and all parties be treated with justice and respect. That's how I would see fairness.
Anybody else?
Immediately what comes to my mind is an image that someone once showed me of 3 Koori kids standing at an AFL match behind a fence, and there's a tall one and a medium-sized one and a small one and 3 boxes, and the tall one stands, the medium-sized one gets 1 box and the small kid gets 2 boxes so they can all watch the footy.
I would say underpinning equity is the idea of human flourishing, and so you don't want everyone to be equally worse off. You want everyone to be flourishing as much as they can and have equal opportunity to do that.
It depends about what we're talking about and which part of the energy system and what for. So if you talk about equity from, at a high level, you talk about equity from emissions reductions, we all benefit from that equally. Some will get more benefit than others, depending on how long they're here. And so there is this emissions reductions conversation that creeps into energy. From an energy system point of view, that equity could be different. Beneficiaries pay or causes pay is common language there, or those sorts of things. And for me, from the organisation I work for, the tension between, and there's more, landholders and a whole lot of others, the tensions between the different types of equity, depending on the policy objectives, starts to get quite confused and can get cherry-picked to suit certain interests. So it's complicated.
It's almost a given, the complication in this. And cherry picking, can we come back to that? I think that's going to be an interesting point. Can I pick up on 3 words? So the notion of justice, Ross, I think is, again, a contested word. So again, I'd like to come back to that. The equity of outcome that you describe, in other words, it's relatively easy to measure. All 3 kids looking over the fence, all 3 kids being able to achieve an outcome. But flourishing, I love that word, by the way. It's one of my favourite words. And so I'm posing this question to myself as much as to you. How do we define flourishing?
I think it's people living in a safe society where they have enough to eat, they have clean water, they have a safe place to live, they can look after their families, there isn't lots of crime or conflict, and people have opportunities to pursue things that they love and to meet together. I think, yeah, it's all of those things.
How does energy, as we're discussing it tonight, relate to flourishing?
I would say human flourishing needs abundant energy. So it needs energy that is low cost, that is on demand, and that is available to everyone because it is low cost. So cost is really, I think, the crucial sticking point of the energy transition. If we cannot do it low cost, then the question needs to be, should it be done?
That's a very interesting question. Does that relate, Ross, to your question of justice?
Well, I think some people in this scenario of renewable energy, the justice has been removed. The Victorian government has taken away farmers' right of appeal, and what that does is that creates an air of frustration that your voice hasn't been heard, and delivers a feeling of steely opposition. And a gentleman I know very well, Ben Duxon, a farmer, multi-generational farmer, is really attached to his land, declared war on renewables about 8 months ago. Now, that's a terrible thing to have a multi-generational farmer declaring war on a government process and policy. And war is like, there will be casualties. And there already has been casualties in this fast-track renewable build process. And I think we've got to avoid that.
Ross has just reminded me that I actually did some undergraduate philosophy. And justice was one of the topics. And what you're saying about, different stakeholders declaring, feeling that the transition is a justice just made me realise in town planning issues, we often take quite a, I'm going to say, Benthamite type approach. So basically, what is the best and most optimal outcome for the greatest number? This is described as utilitarian sort of approaches, is often equated with a just kind of approach. But I was always really attracted to rules and Rawlsian kind of concepts of justice, in which we have to imagine ourselves under the great veil of ignorance. We might be the landholder farmer who's hosting a transmission line and having their way of life, their landscape, the environment that they feel incredibly connected to changed through a process of industrialisation. We might wake up and find ourselves that child born 5 generations into the future, waking up in a climate impacted future where they have to, perhaps they're not flourishing at all because of the kind of impacts that are happening in their environment and around them. We might have to imagine ourselves waking up as the next door neighbour of a wind farm who never signed up for this. We have a lady in the area I live in who has got hyper sensitivity to electromagnetic stuff. And personally, I don't have hypersensitivity to those kinds of things, but this is a person who, in order to cope in their life, has had to have the power shut off. She has a gas fridge. She basically lives by herself in the bush. And she's woken up to have 500 kV power lines traversing her property. So I have to imagine myself under the veil of ignorance, waking up as Sally. And I also have to think of the consumer in Sydney who is needing that air-conditioned bus and that air-conditioned home. So I don't think there are easy answers to the question of what is just and fair in the energy transition. I don't think cost is the most important thing. To me, we have to do it. I don't think... Are we debating whether we have to do it? I'd like to know that. Can we establish that?
It's a really interesting question, which was relating to my next, or relates to my next question. But in my mind, at least, there's a significant confusion here, in as much as this is a move to changing the way energy is created and moved and used. But it's tied up with environmental questions. To what extent are they mutually embedded and simply can't be pulled apart? And to what extent are we able to talk tonight about energy transition divorced from the concept of environment?
I think coming back to the equity one, a theoretical framework, if you like, maybe good, maybe bad. I'm a social scientist by training. So for me, I look at it from an agency perspective, agency and value. So for me, people's agency should be optimised, but no one person or group of persons' agency should come at the expense of another group. And so that's one of the big issues that's rolling around in the transition, whether it's for emissions or energy or whatever. And we've got this constraining of agency and optimising of others' agency. So you get this us and them on multiple planes. And with that agency conversations comes value. What do people value, and how can they extract value, or how can they reduce others' value? So that's in a lens of my organisation where I've got 60,000 bosses. There's probably some Vinnies in here somewhere, or volunteers or parents. I'll get phone calls later, no doubt. That's one thing that we can all agree on in my organisation, or generally agree on, and I think it's a good one to apply in all of these conversations. There are winners and losers of agency, and that's geospatial, at the whole, everywhere.
Can I come back to the question of divorcing? Is it possible to divorce energy?
Why would you want to divorce the environment from saving the environment? It just seems an oxymoron to me. Why is Australia going to eliminate species completely? For example, Robben Island wind farm, where the orange-bellied parrot flies across Bass Strait to Victoria, extremely endangered, critically endangered species, and the government has approved that wind development. They're virtually consigning that species to history. And if you think government makes the right decisions all the time, think about the thylacine in Tasmania. The government put a bounty of £1 per tiger shot, and that virtually eliminated the species. It was a short-term government decision that's come at enormous loss to not just Australia, but the entire world in an environmental sense. There's also another species, which I will touch on, the plains wanderer, and I'm sure there's some environmental students here. The highest population density is on the Pottinger Wind Farm in the Riverina of New South Wales. I made 3 clear recommendations to protect that species, and the species is important not just because it's a species, but it's an entire genus. It's the only species in that genus. So if that species goes extinct, what humanity has lost is the entire genus.
Can I ask you a question, Ross? Do you think that agricultural production business should be subjected to the same level of environmental scrutiny as renewable energy developers? Because one of the things I see in our area is a lot of remnant vegetation is being cleared under very lax local land service regulations, and there is no scrutiny at all. But when I have to read an environmental impact statement for a wind farm, like 700 pages later, and a technical appendice, and then it comes back from the department and says, you know, you haven't included your paper roads in your BDAR, that's your biodiversity assessment report. So you're going to have to go back and do that. And of course, biodiversity assessment takes a really long time because you can't, turns out, you can't, the grass has to be growing. It has to be spring to do a grass field analysis. Who knew? Probably environmental students in this very building. But a farmer who is a host landholder on the very same property can rip their fence lines of timber without any intervention. So just thoughts I have.
All right, thank you. Well, farmers have definitely cleared a lot of land in Australia. The natural vegetation has been cleared over a century and a half, possibly more in some areas. And I think that some of that clearing was overzealous with the benefit of hindsight. But why are we going to fall into a position of doing another overzealous thing of clearing high-value biodiversity areas to save the planet or reduce emissions? And I think that's a really significant issue. Now, I brought along tonight this bunch of books. That's all one report for the Warwick-Nabil Energy Park. That's one document. And what, as farmers, we have to do is read this and come up with a logical reason and argument to try and bring about some sensible renewable development. That's a real...
Do the exact same thing, Ross. I was going to bring an entire wind farm AIS so you could see what went into it and what a farmer or a landholder has to turn in 28 days, consume that and turn it into a meaningful submission. Yeah.
On that theme about, because we are destroying patches of local environment, which in some cases, like in Queensland in particular, that have high biodiversity, they're remnant vegetation, and we're doing this in order to put in wind and solar farms and transmission. And the question is, why are we happy to destroy the environment in a very direct, immediate way in order to save the environment in the future? And I think we need to think about, okay, how is that saving the environment in the future? So, climate change, if it has very large impacts, then it's going to be bad for the environment. But do we have control as Australians over climate change? We are 1% of global emissions. According to the IPCC research, and they are the experts on climate change, nothing Australia does will actually change the temperature in 100 years because we don't have enough control over global emissions. So what has to happen is, and this is the moral argument, is we should lead the charge, we should show other countries how it's done, and then hope that China, India, US, Russia, the countries that do actually have a substantial control as a whole over total global emissions, that they will follow suit and that they will go down the same path, and then that will reduce global emissions. Because remember, it is only global emissions that matters. It is not only Australia's emissions. If we reduce our emissions to zero and the rest of the world keeps going on the same trajectory, nothing will change. We will have done all of this for nothing. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. So the question is, are we actually leading the world? Are people following in our footsteps? And when we look at those countries that I mentioned, they're not. China just went through a period of building 2 coal plants a week. So even if we want to close our coal plants, that isn't actually going to make a difference to global emissions in the scheme of things. So we have to think about, okay, what are the costs of us doing this energy transition? If building renewables was pretty much free and we could sub out the system from coal and gas and go to renewables, and it wouldn't really increase costs, and if it wouldn't destroy the local environment and it wouldn't destroy land for farming and all of that, then sure, we should do it. But we have to think, what are the costs? And so how many people here are maths students? Yes, we've got a couple. Okay, you'll enjoy this. I'll just go into the numbers briefly. So the CSIRO's Gen Cost Report, they do an annual report that compares generation costs for different technologies. And if we look at their renewables cost estimates, their upper bound is $176 per megawatt hour for 90% integrated renewables. And that upper bound is really the only realistic number in their range. They say it could go as low as 125, but the upper bound has the current average capacity factors for wind and solar. 19% for solar, 29% for wind. That just means 19% of the time solar is outputting at full capacity, 29% of the time wind is outputting at full capacity. Those capacity factors will only get worse over time as we build more and more wind and solar, and that's because the lowest hanging fruit has been taken. So you have the windiest sites and the sunniest sites that are close to transmission lines, they all get taken first, and so capacity factors only decline over time as you build more and more wind and solar. And that means that costs go up and up because you have less sun and less wind per turbine and per panel. So that means $176 per megawatt hour. That is a minimum of what we're looking at going forward. Then you factor in extra storage and transmission costs. Transmission has blown out 100% in the past year, according to the energy market operator. And storage costs are likely going to be double what we originally thought, according to Alex Onehouse, a battery expert. Gen cost did not factor this in. So $176 probably looks more like $200 per megawatt hour minimum. The current wholesale prices in Victoria are $100 per megawatt hour. And even our energy minister has said on the record that currently electricity prices are too high, that they're unaffordable for a lot of people. So we're looking at a doubling in our electricity bills. Are we happy for people who are already struggling to pay their electricity bills to have to pay double what they're currently paying? We're looking at smelting industries going offshore. It's just unaffordable because they need very cheap electricity to run. Are we happy for those industries to leave and for those people in those communities to lose their jobs? Are all of those costs, are we happy to pay that in order to do something that won't actually impact the thing we are trying to impact?
Can I ask, Zoe, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. If our smelting goes offshore, will they be going to the countries who are going to be reducing their emissions on our behalf?
Yeah, so we would imagine that smelting would go to countries like China or Indonesia or the countries that have quite coal-intensive grids, which is why it is so important that we keep industry here by having cheap electricity, because regardless, those heavy industry that needs cheap electricity is going to go to those places that has cheap electricity, which tends to be, often it's quite coal-intensive, so.
My question is, I guess, thank you for that response, is if we are not price competitive with coal fire in China and our smelters offshore, who's reducing emissions?
That's a very good question. Currently, India, China and the US, the three biggest emitters in the world, are not adopting net zero. And I thought I'd run through some numbers for those that are interested. Australia in 2023 emitted 373 million tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere. Now that's a huge amount of carbon, but that's up 6% from 2000. When I look at China, China's the number one emitter in the world. They emitted 13.2 billion tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere, up 262% since 2000, and they're doing that with our coal. We're sending 1 million tonnes of coal from Australia to China to be burnt, and our government has taken the position we can't burn any coal here because we're going to save the planet. This is hypocrisy beyond belief.
I tend to agree with you, Ross, but it also goes back to what Zoe was saying about the intensity of the Australian, like the carbon intensity of the Australian economy. I often hear that, what you've just said, Zoe, about, per capita, we are high emitters, but our population's so small, yada, yada, yada. But we're like such large exporters of fossil fuel. It underpins so much of our prosperity.
Or are we talking about prosperity, or are we talking about reducing global carbon emissions?
I'm going to call this, it's a shorthand personal anecdote. I recently went to a meeting of the New South Wales farmers branches locally to, they were releasing the update of the landholder guide in New South Wales, and what's his face? Tony, the Australian Energy Commissioner.
Oh,
Tony Marr.
Sorry.
He was there in his cowboy boots. And a lot of the landholders were really incensed, and they kept talking about eagle blenders. All right, so this is a wind turbine. It blends eagles in the sky like a ninja bullet or whatever they are. And for that audience, the kinds of things that you've just mentioned, like let's call Robben's Island the orange-bellied parrot blender. Well, on the New England, we have wedge-tailed blenders. But as a youngish, I can't call myself a young person anymore, but as a youngish person, I was just on the floor in despair because I'm like, eagle blender, eagle oven, all I know is my grandkids aren't going to see a bloody eagle. And that's the conversation we're in. And I think sometimes we, at least in the New England, when we're a host community, we're seeing the eagle blenders go up and the solar panels go over the paddocks and such. But the why sometimes gets lost or diluted. And I don't think we can, coming back to your question, James, I don't think we can disentangle the energy transition from the why. We're not transitioning our energy grid to renewables for, I was about to say shits and giggles.
What are we transitioning our economy from a fossil fuel base to a renewable base with a high cost of energy as a result? A lot of our industry moving offshore to China.
Because we're facing a global existential threat.
So I guess the question remains, given that we can't control global emissions and other countries will do what is in their best interest, so we're going to have to deal with whatever happens climate-wise in the next few decades, the next century. We will have to deal with that regardless of what we do in terms of renewables. And so, I guess the question is, if we're very concerned about that, why are we not, instead of building renewables and putting lots of money into that, why are we not putting that money into adaptation and trying to find ways to protect our environment against variations in temperature and all of that? Like that's kind of the question, because things will happen regardless. We have no control over that, and changing our energy system won't make any difference. So why not put resources into something that will actually help protect the environment?
I'm very inspired by some of the work by people like Ross Garnaut, who have a vision for what our economy could actually look like in a post-carbon intensity world. And it's a really compelling vision. We have these amazing solar resources. We have amazing wind resources here. I personally want to buy it. I want to buy Ross Garnaut's vision for a renewable superpower. And it brings me hope. But do you have a thought about the superpower kind of vision for the Australian economy?
Yeah, so in terms of Ross Garnaut, what he's been saying recently, I think something he said was very important to remember is that at the moment there are virtually no, was his words, new wind and solar projects being funded by private industry. They are pretty much all being funded by taxpayer underwriting. And so that's a comment from Ross Garnaut I think is very important to remember, because it shows that these projects are not economic and the market knows that. The capture prices for wind and solar have been going down and down, and now they're 50% below the weighted average wholesale price. So the market is saying, stop building these things. We don't need more wind and solar, which tend to generate at the same times, because then we have saturation and we don't have energy when we really need it. which you can only get through dispatchable sources like coal, gas, hydro, nuclear. But yes, so that's something to keep in mind. And sorry, what was the question?
Urban economy, but I really want to hear what Gavin has to say in response.
I'm just having a bit of a chuckle to myself, actually. Lots of conversations about lots of things, and first comment, states, federal government, historically always paid for the energy system. It's only since late 1990s, and I'm that old, I remember the privatisation in Victoria, where private equity was brought in. So government's always had a role. If you add up the ownership in the NEM, the vast majority is still government owned. It's up around 70% anyway. Energy is the engine room of the economy. Energy is the input, and we make stuff, whatever it is, and that's what drives it all. We are paying for two systems, so it is more expensive. The old stuff, unless you're in Queensland where they've got a whole lot of newer old stuff, that's all breaking. And your lawn's held together with sticky tape and blue tack. A strong wind will blow the thing over. And that's, Torrens, they've just directed Torrens back in South Australia, the same sort of stuff. So there is a question here about, how do we finance and who pays for the financing issue, and then what are we paying for? And if you go technology agnostic, governments historically always are in there. They've got a preference and they're underwriting that preference, which they always did. And if private equity to run it, there's views about whether private equity would build the old stuff again or not. At the end of the day, the stuff's breaking and it's got to be replaced. So we can have this argument, and I can guarantee you in about 6 years' time we'll be on the other side of wherever we're going to be, but we'll be on the other side and we won't be going back. And
if I may, I think we're setting up a grid that's going to be on unreliable and intermittent power. The wind energy is generated about 30% of the time. Solar generates when the sun shines. The key for Australia is not energy generation, it's the storage and release of that energy at the time people need it. So I think we should be investing more money and more resources and more innovation in how we store energy from the midday when wholesale energy prices are negative, where you're feeding into the grid with sunshine at a negative price, to when you need it for cooking dinner at 7 o'clock at night to release that energy. And potentially, if I extrapolate this further, the government's building this massive integrated grid. Maybe we don't need a massive integrated grid. Maybe we're going to go back to a 5 kilowatt system on a house with a battery and look after ourselves, which means the investment in the grid is totally lost. It's a lost, redundant asset in 10 or 15 years' time. And I think that's a big, significant decision for the next generation, because you're going to be paying for something that may be redundant, never used, never utilised to deliver energy security to Australia.
There's 3 work streams that all come to a head in 2027 that are working on not necessarily, everything. They're throwing everything they can at it. So the 3 work streams are the Nelson Review, the wholesale Nelson Review. All the economists out there, I encourage you to have a look at that. It's a sort of a pathway to derivatives and other financial instruments to underpin it all and build out firm capacity. And we've got to get there with the spot market, so that's got a medium and a long-term horizon. So that's one thing. Then you've got the Australian Energy Market Commission that's doing a work stream that's looking into pricing for a consumer-driven future. At the moment, we sell kilowatts. I don't want a kilowatt, I want service. So we'll probably end up with a service-type offering, a bit like internet plans, a bit like your home insurance. If you give up control of your inverter, appliances, whatever, you will get a reduction off a fixed price plan. So you sort of build up this service offering. They become the back end for other derivatives, if you like, and packages. Then there's another work stream that comes to a head at the end of this year, which is out of the Federal Department, which is the CERD, Distributed Energy and Consumer Energy Resources work stream. I encourage you to look at that too, which is about having mandated minimum appliance standards where every appliance is visible in the system through the internet. And then that's where the data centres and AI come in, and then you get home energy management systems for small business and homes, and that then starts to wheel load and injections around to actually firm up and reduce and make the capacity that we've got in the system more functional capacity, because you start to play around with injections and load. And all of those come to a head 2027. And in the Nelson Review, the sort of destination when all of this starts to come up in financing, because it is all about money at the end of the day, is around 2031, 2032.
Could I just quickly jump in there? There's, this seems to be a really good point to bring the discussion back to the notion of equity, the notion of justice. There are a number of points that have jumped out at me, at least, where I could imagine there could be a growing disparity between people who, for example, can afford a 5 kilowatt system for a standalone house versus someone who is struggling to pay the rent in a property where the owner will not adopt that system. The sort of things, the reviews you're talking about are predicated on people being able to buy and install and operate the things that make the system work. No.
In an energy system, load is more valuable than injections at the moment. I'm solar. Thank you so much, young people, for funding an old bloke like me who owns their home to put a solar system in subsidised by you, which means I don't have any energy exports, any energy consumption, and all the green schemes are funded through consumption because of the fiscal imbalance between state and federal government, vertical fiscal imbalance. So that's the first thing. There's inequity in there already about how we're funding this because of the tax system. The other thing is the wholesale market between, say, 10:30 and about 4 o'clock every day, well, not every day, but more often than not, is negative. Jump around and have a look at it. They are paying people to switch on appliances now. And I've got a mate he's got kids, they're under 12, and he says, would you want 3 pizza tonight? And the kids go, yeah, like that. They want amber. And they sit there and switch on appliances in the middle of the day to make 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And then they have pizza that night. So he's managed to gamify on an amber product. So load is when you've got abundant generation all at the one time that's not dispatchable. You can't switch it off. Rooftop solar just floods the system. It's free and they pay you to take it. And that's a huge opportunity for business and everything. But you've got to have the metering stock and all the back ends, the AI to make it work. So that's where all that's coming. And that's great for low income people, low wealth people, which we care about. Because the system was actually subsidised by governments for high wealth, high income, and the worm has turned. Too much of that stuff now.
But yeah, I would say, could I just come back to Russ's point on why doesn't everyone just get rooftop solar, get batteries, go off grid? Why are we building the grid in the first place? And I think you can see the fact that people aren't doing that shows why, because the economics don't stack up. Because if you want reliable electricity, you need to have something there to give it to you when the sun doesn't shine and when your battery has gone flat, because batteries just can't provide the kind of reliability that dispatchable generation can. If you have a number of days with low solar output, you're screwed. So that is why, generally speaking, very few people go off-grid realistically unless they're very, very far away from the grid in the first place, because you have to get a diesel generator. You have to have that backup. And that's what's happening now as we're trying to build this renewables-dominated grid, is we're having essentially that diesel generator backup, but on a very big scale in terms of gas peakers. And that is very expensive because then you have all of this kit sitting around doing nothing most of the time, and then all of a sudden you need it to basically run the entire grid. So you have lots and lots of wind capacity, lots and lots of solar capacity, lots and lots of gas capacity, and they all have to be able to support the entire grid, pretty much, instead of just having a little bit above what you would usually need of dispatchable coal and gas in order to fund the grid. So the more capacity you have sitting around doing nothing, the more costs you have when you've got that doubling and tripling up. But coming back to the equity question with rooftop solar, I've written a paper on this, and essentially, and I think Gavin's touched on this a little bit with the generational aspect, because the way that the network tariff system works, which is basically just the network charges and how they're divvied up between people, is it mostly charges you for, like, it recoups the network costs through consumption charges. And so that means rooftop solar owners, they're not consuming very much a lot of the time, but they're still likely to be drawing on the grid during the peak, like the evening peak when there's no sun and when everyone comes home from work and switches everything on. And that evening peak, the absolute maximum peak in, say, a year, is what actually drives future upgrade costs, because you have to know what's the maximum that's going to be drawn from the grid. Just the average daily network utilization doesn't really matter as much. It's just like when you're building a highway, you've got to think, okay, what's kind of the biggest traffic jam that I need to accommodate for, not just an average Tuesday at 12 p.m. And so that's what drives network upgrade costs. But the thing is, most of the network costs are already fixed because the network has been built, and so those network companies get paid by consumers for the network that they are building, that they've already built, that they are now operating. And so because they're mostly fixed, just because someone is able to reduce their consumption and therefore reduce the amount of network charge they're paying doesn't mean that those fixed costs go away. They're still there. There's still the same amount of fixed cost. So that has to get put onto other consumers who are not able to reduce their consumption, and those other consumers are people who don't have rooftop solar. So rooftop solar owners, we did the maths, they are saving about 2.5 to 4 times around that more than their generation is providing to the grid in terms of its actual value. And that's because they're avoiding these network charges. And this is really concerning, because that means bills go up, charges go up for everyone who doesn't have rooftop solar, and those people tend to be renters, young people, those with low incomes, apartment dwellers, and it's a massive generational and wealth equity issue there. And the problem is people think, yay, rooftop solar is amazing, it saves me money on my bills, therefore solar generation will save everyone money in the grid, but really their savings are coming from robbing Peter to pay Paul, largely speaking. So that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind when we're trying to extrapolate from the kind of micro level to the macro grid level.
Thank you. That's really enlightening. Yeah, of course.
Could I just touch on one equity issue that I think's completely overlooked so far? And that's the equity between wealthy nations like Australia and nations that are generally food importers like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt, Iran. Globally, the population of humans is currently 8.2 billion people on the planet. The United Nations Population Committee is forecasting 10 billion people by 2061. That's a huge increase in population, and the arable land, the land that goes to produce crops, in the last 60 years or so, has almost dropped by 1/3. So we've got to feed a growing population on a declining farmland base. When Australia signed the Paris Agreement for net zero, they also agreed to not impact negatively the food production from Australia. Now, our government is totally ignoring the negative impacts and the loss of food production land. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because in Australia, we produce 3 times more food than we consume domestically, and it's not a political imperative to them. But I can tell you for certain, in Egypt, in Pakistan, in India, in Indonesia, those people are very concerned about where their next meal's coming from. And our government is not considering at all the political security of our nation if those countries are hungry.
You are speaking the language of the anti-coal seam gas activists in the Liverpool Plains. So these land use conflicts, the energy system in Australia has been underwritten by, coal and gas. Those same kinds of land use conflicts between prime agricultural land and energy production, they have been part of the landscape of political jousting in Australia for a really long time. I think you come from a cropping area, right?
That's correct.
Amazing wheat belt, right? Yes. Yeah. I come from a grazing area. We grow Wagyu beef and superfine merino, and I don't personally, but amazing people I live near do. There's not that conflict so much with grazing. Certainly, they're running sheep under solar in the New England, and of course, we don't improve pasture much. So cattle grazing and breeding is not really compromised either. But are you finding that there's a lot of land use conflict in your area?
All I'm saying when you talk about justice and we're talking about what's in Australia's best interests, we aren't really considering what's in humanity's best interests. And I think that's got to be a consideration for justice to be fair to all.
It's the water.
Well, I think it's water, food, but I can tell you hungry people are unsettled people. And a good example of that is the Arab Spring that occurred in 2008. The price of wheat tripled and nearly every government in the Middle East was overthrown in a very short period of time. So food security provides political security. In Australia, as a first world nation, we have an absolute vested interest in having political security around the world.
So just to repeat my question, is there an inherent conflict between agricultural production that you're seeing in the Wimmera and large-scale solar or wind? Like, what's going on in your region?
Yes.
Okay. What does that look like?
Well, at Warracknabeal, there's an energy park that's proposed to provide 19% of Victoria's energy requirements, but that's going to take out of production some agricultural land. For instance, my farm produces around about probably 15 million loaves of bread per year. We produce around about 55,000 kegs of beer. We have something like 3 million lamb chops. Every farm in Australia is an important food producing place to provide that level of food security. There's nothing more insecure than a hungry human.
It also, in the context of Australia, it just doesn't make any sense that we have so little high inherent fertility, strategic biophysical agricultural land. Why we would be surrendering that to energy production, it boggles the mind, particularly when we have so much marginal land. Like, we've got a lot of marginal land that we can't farm.
Well, if I just add a little bit more to that. So agriculture is important to humanity because the human population is growing. Why is agriculture important to Australia? We feed everyone in Australia, and we provide 14% of our export revenue. Why is agriculture important to Victoria, the state we're in today? Victorian farmers control 1.5% of Australia's landmass, and yet Victorian farmers produce 25% of Australia's agricultural output.
It's
Every acre of land in Victoria is important to produce food, and they're going to put transmission lines, large-scale solar and wind on our most productive food-producing land.
And yet in places like Southwest Res over the river, so Southwest Res is around Hayshire, in the southwest part of New South Wales, and their inherent fertility and their productive capacity isn't as high, so they have a lot of, I think they're drought affected mostly. You would know better than me, Ross. So, is it grazing as well? Yeah. So, in an area like that, there is a sense that the renewable rollout is a way to diversify on-farm income and provide resilience in the agricultural sector. Is that something that you hear in your area as well? Because we certainly hear that if a farmer's earning $40,000 a year for one wind turbine, that's a lot of drought-proof income.
There are some farmers that will be getting $2 million a year for their wind turbines. Do you think they don't want them? Of course they bloody well do. And they're not interested in food security. They're interested in what's in their family's best interest. But from a national point of view, and as future leaders of our country, you've got to decide what are the limited, scarce resources that we can't afford to sacrifice. And that's a burning question for the younger generation that I'll leave with them.
Thank you, Ross. That's, I want to pick up on what you're saying in relation to these guys, because we're running out of time, and ultimately it's the future leaders, as you call them, here, who are going to have to grapple with this question of who pays what for what. Fundamentally, we're in a situation where we are constricted by policy. Things are rolling out faster than we have the capacity to even think about, let alone negotiate. So we are where we are. What are the possibilities for these guys in terms of the future of, in the medium and the long term, of changing trajectories either way in relation to energy policy? For example, a really interesting discussion over here in relation to coal. So coal clearly provides a stable base power load, but your point about them falling apart and the cost to rebuild. So how can we get involved in making changes to policy, being involved in policy that will have a meaningful impact on who pays what for what?
I'll give that a go. I'll come back to the vertical fiscal imbalance. And that sounds flashy, but basically states, under the Constitution, the states are responsible for energy policy, but they don't have taxing powers to do it all. So which is why you're seeing each state doing whatever it does, sticking stuff in, and then you load it up on voters' bills, and then the whole politics plays out, and it's quite toxic. Really, energy policy needs to be done through the federal government. It's the one that can make the big decisions. So what we're talking about, we're talking the big policy decisions, but it's all being done at a state base. So for me, I think the game is, how do you get the states to hand over energy policy to the federal government? And then you can say, well, Victoria, we might not have any renewables. We probably don't need it. We just have a transmission line that runs up from Tassie, South Australia, New South Wales in. And that would be a much better system, because there's places that would love to host renewables, perfectly. But because each state is going off its own frolic, you're doubling up, it's not coordinated, there's additional cost that's in there, the politics doesn't get dealt with well. So future leaders, if you're going to be state politicians, get energy policy up to the feds. If you're going to be federal politicians, make sure the states hand it up. Then you've got the levers to do it properly. However, whatever you want to build, you'll be able to build it and fund it cheaper, coordinate it, and it'll be a better outcome, because at the moment it's very ad hoc, and it's very jurisdictional, and it's up and down and slow and.
Yeah, I'd say, there definitely are issues with, we have a federal approach with the integrated system plan that the energy market operator does, but then because states are then, there's sort of these perverse incentives for them to try and make it look like, oh, we'll sink this cost in there, and then that will mean that we'll get this transmission line, and so the systems are pretty messed up at the moment. But I would question whether having, say, Victoria have, just transmission lines everywhere and not be self-sufficient in energy generation is a good idea, because we did have South Australia pretty much try that. They mostly rely on renewables, and they had a statewide blackout in 2016 when their interconnector went down in a storm. So I think it is important that big load centres like major cities do have dispatchable capacity nearby. And that comes back to the whole coal question. So looking back at the costs, when I was talking about the $176 per megawatt hour, which then will become probably more like $200 per megawatt hour for renewables. Coal, new coal, looking at the gen cost numbers and kind of making those assumptions more reasonable, you're looking at $70 to $80 per megawatt hour. And as I was saying before, Victoria is currently paying $100, so that's below what you're currently paying for wholesale prices. So building new coal would bring down electricity prices. Refurbishing would be something like $50 per megawatt hour, so that would be something to do in the short term. And so I think just knowing the costs there, and what I've talked about before with, why are we doing renewables? I think, something I'd just like everyone to think about is, why are we demonizing coal, especially when the rest of the world is not, and they're building it more and more and more going forward? And just kind of question that. And similar thing with gas as well, but particularly coal, given that it's the cheapest we have in this country.
Why are we demonizing coal? Because it's very carbon intense. And I take your point. I think we should have a technologically, agnostic tech, but we should have a carbon price. So if we need to reduce carbon emissions, let's price carbon. And then look at your costs.
Yeah, I do agree. If you're wanting to reduce carbon as a whole economy, the most efficient way to do it is a carbon price that is across everything. The problem is we tried that and voters didn't like it, and there's a reason people don't like it. It's because it transparently shows how much the energy transition is going to cost everyone. Because electricity, that is an input to everything, so it makes everything more expensive. You think we're in a cost of living crisis now? Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, because as I said, doubling electricity prices, that means prices for everything goes up. And so I think, it comes back to, at the moment, the costs are being hidden. They're being shoved onto taxpayers through the capacity investment scheme, which funds wind, solar, batteries, through contracts where we have no idea how many billions the government is actually going to give to these renewables investors from all of your taxes. And so our children and grandchildren will be paying for this. And there is this really concerning lack of transparency. And so I would agree, if we wanted to reduce carbon and that was the ultimate goal, then we should have a transparent carbon price so everyone knows how much it costs. But as soon as that happens, as soon as you have a transparent price, voters don't want it. They don't want to pay more. Survey after survey shows that people are very unwilling to pay more to reduce carbon. People want things to be affordable. So I think that's just a reality that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I was just going to try to explain to the students how you can have a difference on energy policies in Australia. My daughter, youngest daughter, was born in 1997, and she came to Melbourne University and studied global politics and international relations. She was in St Hilda's, just over the back from here. Rebecca Johns, now bear in mind I'm opposed to a fast-track renewable bill, diametrically opposed, and I dislike Chris Bowen's fast-track policy and ludicrous rushed build. But my daughter works for Chris Bowen as Global Policy Officer for Global Energy Security, Innovation and Transition, Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. So if you want to make a difference in energy policy and do something wonderful for Australia, study hard and take the opportunities when they present, and you too could be working for Chris Bowen.
Thank you so much. All right, we're about to break for a couple of minutes. There'll be dessert that will be coming round. We've got a couple of questions, though, before we do that, because there are a couple of people who need to leave quickly. So can we have just one question before we break for dessert?
Murray told me not to have a longer preamble. I've got 2 points. Firstly, on the panel, thank you all very much. Exciting. Now, just put your hand up if you own an animal. An animal. Do you have an animal? A pet. You got a pet? Great. Okay. Now, this question is on behalf of a friend of mine who is a member of the Animal Justice Party. I want you to listen very carefully. Simple question. Now I have a dog called Winnie, who's 10, a cavoodle, and my friend who lives 3 hours from me, is my biographer actually, and she has a cat called Chloe. Now Chloe has fresh tuna chopped up, and my dog called Winnie has chopped up chicken breast with rice. Now I can tell you one thing, Winnie, very upset if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, the refrigerator doesn't work, so what do I have to do? I have to go outside, turn on the barbecue with a gas bottle and cook the breast chicken. And also my friend, I won't name her because I don't want to name it here, I know it's Chatham House rules, but she'll go out and get that chopped up tuna, put it on her barbecue with a gas bottle. Well, the question is, would you prefer to have a barbecue with a gas bottle or a solar panel? And do you the Justice Party, the Animal Justice Party, entering in a coalition with with a Liberal National adopt a nuclear policy? And I was on the board of the Clean Energy Regulator until November last year, and I can tell you now, nuclear has no emissions. So if you really believe in no emissions, you go nuclear. Do you agree?
It does seem rather strange that Australia has enormous resources. 1,200 years of coal resources. We have gas that we're sending to China, 56% of which has no royalties, none whatsoever. Why is our government looking after multinationals and companies rather than looking after the interests of Australians? And we have excellent uranium. We're the Saudi Arabia of uranium in the world. We mine it, we send it over to everywhere else, and we limit ourselves. We're actually handicapping ourselves by not using all these wonderful resources for our benefit and the next generation's benefit and the following generation's benefit that live in Australia. We should be looking at how we can utilise all those resources for our benefit. I'd be in favour of banning exports to China to save the planet, because that will have 10 times more the impact, a bigger impact on carbon emissions than us destroying our prime agricultural land, getting rid of unique Australian wildlife. It just doesn't make sense. It's almost like our government hates the Australians.
All right, on that note, before we start a revolution, dessert is about to be served, I think. Is that right, Poppy? Yep, perfect. So within about... could I introduce Jack? Has everybody met Jack? Please stand up, Jack.
We've got a number of questions that have come through, and thank you all so much for asking those questions. Unfortunately, given the number of them, we probably won't be around to be able to get around to every single one. So I've picked out some key questions that we'll ask in 5 minutes. But for now, keep sending your questions through, collate them, and it will be time for it to be open to the floor after I ask 2-3 key point questions for anyone to ask their own questions. Enjoy. You have 5 minutes or so to discuss between yourself. First, I'd just like to say thank you for everyone coming tonight. This is truly a great event and a very key discussion in the future for Australia. Now, getting straight into the questions, we've had a number of questions come in tonight, and quite a recurrent theme was a question around jobs. It was aimed at if we're going to undergo a transition around renewables, it would likely leave a lot of rural communities, communities which are based around mining, communities which are based around these fossil fuel industries. How can we ensure that their jobs will be transferable, their skills will be transferable into other industries, so we're not leaving these marginalised communities with intergenerational debts?
Gavin, do you want to tackle that one? I've got a response, but...
You go first.
It's a really tough one. I think there are two things around the energy transition. You've mentioned industrial closures, and I think that is a really difficult one. The Mayor of Muswellbrook recently told me that I'm not allowed to use the word transition. I have to say industrial closures when it comes to coal infrastructure in the Hunter Valley. And the reason for that is partly that, well, the operational jobs in renewable energy, there are very, very few in comparison to coal jobs, but also the kinds of skill sets are quite different. And that's not to say that those workers won't be redeployed into, I don't know, mineral sands, critical minerals, like we've still got to dig a lot of holes in the ground. But they won't be in Muswellbrook anymore, so it will be very difficult for that community. And they're facing, for example, the local government there is facing the loss of millions of dollars in rates revenue when those power stations go down. So there's going to be a massive impact, for sure. But the other thing that is the case in the thing that keeps me up at night, right, with the renewable rollout, is where the heck are we going to get all these people to build these things? Because in the New England res, the forecast peak workforce is like bigger than the town I live in. And because there is a kind of lack of coordination, we are racing to roll these things out. And I get developers coming in and saying, okay, well, in 2028, I'm going to have I need 400 people to put up a wind farm. And then the next guy comes through the door and says, in 2028, I'm going to need 400 people to put up a wind farm. And then the next guy comes through the door and says, in 2028, I'm going to need 500 people to install a solar farm. I'm like, okay, we're up to 1,500 people. And local planners and employment agencies in every res in New South Wales is having the same conversation with the same 5 developers, and we're like, where are these people coming from? So there is fear in my community that there will be a massive labour shortage. We don't want the jobs necessarily if it's unplanned and uncoordinated and we haven't identified how we're going to build that workforce. Right now, in New South Wales at least, there is a very large effort to model and understand what kind of workforce. I'm thinking that it's some kind... Do you remember the Green Army back in the Howard years, where everyone got out of year 12 and went and planted 1 billion trees? Does anyone else remember that employment scheme, the Green Army?
Absolutely, I do.
Yeah. I'm thinking there is a solar panel plugging in army. And if you're in year 12 now, or year 11 now, you're going to be recruited like in the army. Conscripted, that's the word, to plug in solar panels.
Why should coal workers or any other workers necessarily get extra special treatment and privilege. I'll give an example. There's students in here doing arts degrees, maybe musicians, whatever you want. AI is coming. Screenwriters and all that sort of stuff. AI is coming and replacing those jobs. I used to have DVDs, that used to be a thing. VHS, Blockbuster video, that industry changed as well. Typewriters got replaced by computers. Oh, there is so many industries that I can name that have gone the way of the dodo, and it's because of progress. Now, that's not to say they aren't important as humans, and those communities need support in the transition, but we manage that, and that's what governments do, and that's how we support the transition to do those things. And we do it everywhere else, but we never have those conversations when those industries are in transition like we do in energy. And I think that comes back to the politics of it all, and how it has been politicised.
And yeah, I would just question the idea that doubling people's electricity bills or more is progress. But that being said, yeah, it is an issue with the jobs with renewables, because just like how renewables tend to have, rushes and gushes of wind and solar output, it's similar with jobs. You have these massive increases in, we need all of these people in this one area, and then nothing, because wind and solar farms, generally speaking, you don't have a whole lot of people hanging around working on them long term. They just kind of sit there most of the time. And so it just makes it very hard to create communities and maintain the communities that are already there in these regional areas, because generally speaking, other industries, so coal, gas, mining, heavy industry where you have factories that are there for many decades supporting jobs, that's something where you can actually form a community around it, because you have this amazing economic asset in the community that provides jobs for decades and generations. But wind and solar just cannot replace that. And so we're going to be shutting coal generators, but we're also going to be shutting heavy industry as well. So it's not just the coal towns, it's all of the towns that have factories that need cheap electricity. All of that will be gone. And so the question becomes, will we even have regional towns? I mean, we'll have agriculture in terms of not where the wind and solar farms have gone through there, but that's pretty much all that will be left in the regions. And so are we willing to sacrifice all of that in order to do something that won't actually have an impact on global emissions in a material way?
Thank you for responding to that question. It's a very interesting point. One of the other questions that was coming up, there's a lot of people here who are from university, a lot of young people, and we're told quite commonly that the debts and the loss that will come about as a result of climate change, which is obviously a key aspect when we consider the transitioning into the renewable, will be massive. That we will be left with debts not only from attempted transitions, but also debts due to disasters, debts due to increasing climate emissions, raising the cost of producing food. And so there's a lot of climate anxiety in a lot of youth, and a lot of youth are wondering, what can we do as youth to really get around it? If we can't turn to the energy industry, as might be suggested tonight, what can we do? Or would the debts that will be generated in the future from these climate-induced disasters actually outweigh the debts of potentially investing in renewable energies nowadays?
Can I just answer that a little? A forecast is just really a forecast about what's happening. What we should deal in is the facts and the reality. The reality is that carbon is growing in the atmosphere. I think science is not fully determined on exactly what the consequences of that will be. So I think if we deal in reality, building a fast-track renewable transition in Australia is going to bring to extinction some of our very unique wildlife. That's a reality. That's happening right now. What's going to happen in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time? Who knows? There might be a volcanic eruption and suddenly the whole planet is 5 degrees cooler. There's no way you can forecast the future with certainty. So there's always some element of unknown about what's forecast to come.
The intergenerational equity issue. if we believe that emissions do cause global warming, I built my wealth on emissions by coal, and I'm doing pretty well. And on top of that, I've been underwritten by young people in rental properties to stick solar on my roof, which means I'm avoiding the build costs to replace those emitting generators with non-emitting generators. So I've managed to rob Peter and get you to pay Peter, or whatever it is, however that works. So you could argue, and I'm not a big fan of it, but you could argue there's things like, how do you strip my wealth to pay for the pollution I've caused on the way out, which means the younger generation doesn't have to pay for it. So they pay for their own bit. So there is this intergenerational conversation about how do you extract from me, and it could be through death tax, it could be through wealth tax, there's a whole lot of ways to do it, and they're not popular. But if you don't do that and broaden the tax base, it's going to be left to the future people. And that's a problem, because then you guys won't be able to get ahead. Your generation won't be better than my generation. It'll take you longer to buy a house, raise kids, do all those sorts of, and that's bad for the economy as well. So it's a really thorny question.
Sorry, Gavin, as much as I love talking about inheritance taxes and any conversation about taxation, I think there is a principle that I've just learned about actually in local government, which is that when we're making massive investments, because as you mentioned before, we've got a whole fleet of generators, coal-fired generators, that are coming towards end of life. And you could argue to some extent that your taxes during your lifetime have actually contributed to keeping that fleet up and the transmission and the grid up. And if it was debt funded or funded out of the tax base. So I learned recently that it's a principle in local government to have a certain amount of debt over your capital works, such as roads and swimming pools, etc., because it's a way of actually ensuring that one generation of ratepayers doesn't bear the full cost of really long-lived assets. So if we think a lot about the debt that we're going to be left with, but perhaps we're not thinking enough about the asset that we're also going to need to share the cost of over multiple generations.
And council rates are calculated on
Sorry?
wealth. So the rate base, council rate base, is on a value of your land. So it's a wealth tax. It's not a current tax. So it's based on embedded.
It's a land tax. I love a land tax.
Yeah, which is an embedded charge that's always been there. Unlike energy, which is not embedded, it was always put and paid off over future generations. But when you're doing a huge front-end capital upload, which is coming out of the pockets now, and that externality hasn't been factored in, but it's being factored in now, that is intergenerational, and that is a problem.
Why didn't we factor in the need to repurpose? Why don't we have a nice big fund sitting there for the clapped out coal power system?
There's all these conversations that are going on about how you do accelerated depreciation, how you allocate the cost. There's issues about how you fund future equity and who pays and who wears the risk. At the moment, when you've got governments in there, it does come back to us as the taxpayer, because private equity is not putting up a whole lot of hand, and they're wearing risk, and those investors, it's just different.
Could I talk about the intergenerational stuff a little bit? And we're in Victoria, and Victoria's debt as a state is absolutely massive compared to any other state in Australia. That debt is actually a debt that future taxpayers are going to pay. So Victoria, from a young person's point of view, you guys are going to be liable to pay more income tax or taxes on your assets than any other state in Australia. And I think that's unfair. And the person that predominantly was involved in that build-up of debt has just been in China with Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. And I think what he's actually done to Victoria was under instruction from China. And if that's the case, what's happened is the next generation is going to be enormously impacted.
To my point, though, and I appreciate that, the good news is if Dan Andrews is there having conversations with these global leaders, then perhaps our security situation isn't as bad as what you thought.
It could be a whole lot worse.
Just on that debt thing and thinking about asset, like Victoria's built some pretty, like I just went past a pretty nice looking new train station. We've built a lot of stuff in Victoria over this past little bit, and that was off the back of a lot of decades of underinvestment. I mean, I'm not going to defend the COVID debt ratchet and all the things that happened there, but I do think that there is a difference between incurring debt on stuff that we need to have productivity in the economy going forward, like transport infrastructure. There is good debt and then there's bad debt. And I guess I'd ask you, Ross, is like how much of Victoria's debt do you think is bad debt?
I would say anything that was built up with nothing tangible to show for it, like better roads or better infrastructure or more efficient transport routes or better education for the next generation. And in fact, I'm fully in favour of free education in Australia rather than squandering our wealth on stupid, ridiculous programs that are going to soak up a lot of money. We may as well have an educated society that can make better decisions in the future. And these guys, you young people are going to come out of university with a HECS debt most likely, and you're going to have a debt with the state. So you're actually being penalised with all these things from the previous generation. And I think that's very unfair on the young people in Australia. That's only my opinion.
Sorry, unfortunately I'm going to have to cut off that line of questioning because we're running out of time and we'd like to open up to the floor for people if they have any particular questions. So if anyone has any questions, you feel free to raise your hand and I'll be coming around with other people to hand some mics.
Hi, my name is Aditi. This is a question for you, Zoe. You made a point around Australia has a very small contribution globally to emissions. And so we should be investing instead of emissions in protecting or defending our environment. What were you thinking of, or what do you suggest we do to defend or protect our environment? What are the alternative investments that you are thinking of, looking at, researching, considering? Thank you.
So I'll just preface this by saying I'm not an expert in climate adaptation, but I think there are some very obvious things we can do. The first being have cheap electricity prices and have industrial capacity, because just thinking about natural disasters, how are you going to rebuild buildings if you can't afford to make bricks in your country, if you can't afford to make steel? And so that's just having a resilient economy where we still maintain our industrial capacity and we can afford to do those things is an obvious thing. Also just making sure people can afford to pay for air conditioning, because in terms of heat waves, people don't really die from heat waves if they're able to be in an air-conditioned room. Like, we have the technology to prevent deaths, and we've actually seen dramatic decreases in climate-related deaths in the last century, and that's largely because of human ingenuity and the technology that we've been able to invent and to spread to the majority of the population. So I think it's just those basic things, and also things like planting trees in suburbs that are currently concrete jungles, because tree cover can reduce temperatures by 8 degrees, and so I think that having those green spaces is really important, and we should be thinking about that when we are planning new suburbs, and not just leaving people with a bunch of concrete. Because it's not exactly a fun thing to be experiencing when there's a heat wave. So, yeah, things like that.
Any other questions?
Great. Thank you. Really exciting panel. Thanks so much. Can I just ask this question? How is it that solar panels and batteries, which last between 10 to 25 years, are regarded as a long-term investment, and yet we're borrowing money or all this money from overseas for an investment that's not really the future? Isn't it wasted investment? Shouldn't we be spending on something that lasts a lot longer, that truly can provide intergenerational equity, instead of something that's gone almost tomorrow?
It's a really, really important point. I think the transmission was actually more what I was thinking, and obviously wind farms, which have a 40-year lifespan. Solar panels are surprisingly short-lived, and as somebody who works for local government, that is a problem that will land on us, because the waste stream apocalypse will come down the line really quickly, and actually it's something that's very urgently needs to be addressed and understood, is that a lot of the solar PV that we're installing on our rooftops and at grid scale is kind of has no end of life plan. The end of life plan at the moment is so, like many things in this renewable energy transition, we are building the plane we're trying to fly. So for me on the ground, all I know is that we need to solve that problem. What do we do with solar panels at end of life if this is the path we're going down? So one of the initiatives that we are working on is there is a bunch of money going into R&D around this. Australia invented solar panels, so let's see if we can invent recyclable solar panels too. We are partnering hopefully with the University of Newcastle. We would really like in our region to be hosting essentially prototype the issue is not necessarily the technology, it's then that next commercialisation scale as well. There are some really smart people trying to apply themselves to that problem. And yeah, I just want to reiterate that the problem for me on the ground at the coalface of this, a lot of my fellow panellists kind of working on this at this really high policy levels, like Gavin saying that, the federal government should be ultimately responsible for, I agree with you in principle, but oh my God, does that mean I have to deal with the feds at local government level? That sounds like difficult in some ways from an implementation point of view. I lost my train of thought. I'll let somebody else.
I guess what I would say about agriculture, we all need to eat 3 times a day. We can go without power for maybe a few days, a few weeks, but no one can go without food. We've got to make sure our government has the right priorities. Intergenerational farms are thinking 100 years ahead, maybe 3 or 4 generations. The bureaucrats like VicGrid and AusNet, they've got a 15-year plan. The politicians, their plan is till the next election. There's nothing long-term about how a politician thinks. We should have a 100-year strategic plan for water in Australia. We should have a 100-year strategic plan for energy. We should have a 100-year strategic plan for how we're going to make our population more wealthy, more secure and more safe.
And that's why Dan Andrews is in China.
Oh, geez. Unfortunately, we only have time for one, maybe two more questions. So if you'd like to ask, put your hand up.
Thank you. There was a lot spoken about how that nothing Australia does matters pretty much because China does so much more. But do we not have an onus on doing something as a developed country as opposed to developing one? Like when we were industrializing and a lot of other industrialized nations were industrializing years ago, there was no backlash for the emissions. But can we not give China the same level of standards as they're using non-renewables to lift their population out of poverty? Whereas we've already done that, so we should be then front-running and using renewables to kind of set an example because we have already developed. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say it comes back to the issue of, yes, if we were able to set an example by transitioning to a renewables-dominated grid that was affordable and that kept our economy intact, that other countries could follow, then that would be the right thing to do. But as I've explained, it's not affordable. Our industry will not be able to stay if we transition to a renewables-dominated grid, and so other countries will not follow our suit. The countries that are furthest into the wind and solar dominated grid, in terms of Denmark, I think is above 60% wind and solar now. It has, I believe it's currently the second highest electricity prices in the world. Germany is currently the highest and they are further ahead than we are. So the countries that are trying this are not exactly setting an example that most countries are going to want to follow. And that's why we see China. Yes, China is actually building a lot of renewables, but they're able to do that because they're building a lot of coal and also some nuclear as well. And so they're able to keep renewables at a fairly low percentage of their grid. And so the coal can kind of keep the costs down for the whole grid, even as they expand everything. But I think that developing countries should be able to have cheap energy. They should be able to build coal plants if that is the cheapest thing for them. They should be able to lift their people out of poverty. And I don't think that developed countries should say to those countries, oh, we've been able to use fossil fuels to become rich, but you're not allowed to use them.
So that goes back to my question, where are the carbon emissions reductions coming from?
And I would say the answer is they're not coming from anywhere, because globally emissions are going up, and I think they're probably going to continue to go up over the next number of decades. But for Australia, there's not a lot that we can do about that. So we have to deal with the reality before us and do what we can to prepare for the future, knowing that we ultimately don't have control over it.
There's an interesting idea in that, I think, because we're talking about justice and fairness, and there's the world as it is, and then there's the world as it ought to be. And often when we're pursuing themes of justice and equity, we're trying to imagine a future world that ought to be, not the one that is.
If you look at the global emissions, the countries that are expanding their emissions the most are the growing economies of China, India. The declining economies are reducing emissions like Germany and the US. It seems to me that emissions are tied to economic growth. So if we're going to allow India and China to continue to expand their emissions, the entire global economy is going to be located in those two countries. Is that something that Australia is happy to let happen?
Following on that one, but differently, because I can. I think it's about a strategic economic advantage. These are new technologies. People will want them. We used to make new technologies. I don't know whether investing in old technologies locally actually skills up our workforce, creates new production for new products, uses our gift that we've got as Australia with our rare earths and all the stuff that's in the ground. We're best off value adding that here. So for me, I look at it about purely selfishly in a sense. We should be doing this because it builds out our strategic advantage. We get to sell into the EU because they do prefer stuff that's made from emissions reductions. We get to build new technologies based around AI and all that sort of stuff with our minerals that go into it. So that's why I think we should be doing it. Strategic economic advantage, and the emissions are just, and it does emissions.
Answering that question. Unfortunately, we've got time for one more question, as it is 9:30, and we will be being pushed out of here soon.
Thanks. My name's Andrew Phelan. My comment is, I have a comment to make because it hasn't come up in the debate so far, and that's the security implications of the grid, particularly with batteries and particularly with anything that's connected to the internet. The code is written offshore and is updated offshore. I think you know where I'm heading with this, right? So in the state of Texas, for example, the Governor Abbott has prohibited investment in that infrastructure from the PRC because the PRC has a doctrine called civil-military fusion, where they can attack infrastructure in a country. In the Ukraine war, we've seen shelling of energy plants on both sides of that conflict and so on. And I think given the geopolitical circumstances we find ourselves in, and I did a short interview on Sky News this morning at 6:45 on Andrews in the big military parade, so it's been a long day, but I think that's something that needs to be part of the equation as well.
Can I add to that also, that on top of the security issues, because I was very surprised to learn that our 400 megawatt battery just being installed was going to be updated from California. There is issues around right of repair and our capacity to refurbish and restore technologies that have patents over them, even if we're talking about allies. So beyond the security dilemma, I do think that we should be thinking very strategically about when, Ross, you'd know this better than me, this malarkey about, certain tractors not being able to be fixed.
John Deere, yeah. That's correct. John Deere has a contract. You've got to service your tractor with John Deere to be good. But I was going to touch on the security for Australia. I guess what we've really got to work out as Australians is what are our core values? What are our deep core values that we hold dear? And to me, it's free speech and freedom of choice of what we do. If we're going to protect that and guard against authoritarianism or other countries with a different approach to freedom, like a re-education camp, of which I'm sure if China took over Australia, I'd be their first customer. The challenge with those things, if we disagree with government, our mind has to be re-altered to conform. I totally reject that. In fact, I value and love freedom of choice, freedom of expression, and free speech. The question for our young people, and all young people, and my children as well, is what do you hold dear? Is it access to the internet? Is it global justice? Or is it the capacity to be free and think free and express that openly and fairly?
And just coming to the security point, I think it's important when we're thinking about national security and our electricity grid to think about system stability and how fragile is our grid. And a good example of this going wrong is Spain. So Spain and Portugal had countrywide blackouts recently, and that was caused by a solar inverter having a fault that then sent this sort of oscillation that messed up the voltage throughout the system. Basically resulted in a whole bunch of wind and solar shutting off, and the entire grid of both countries went down for pretty much a whole day, and 11 people died. So that's something where we've really got to be thinking carefully, are we looking at system security enough? And how fragile are we making our system when we have, if we're taking out pretty much all of the synchronous generators, which is currently coal, that is providing that oscillation which we need at 50 hertz for our system to keep running. Because solar and wind, they don't provide that, they follow the oscillation. And so we've seen that example with Spain with things going wrong. Do we want to follow in that path, which will make us very vulnerable if we do get into a tricky geopolitical situation?
It's a really big discussion in control rooms that I've been in, both transmission and distribution. Two schools of thought are running around at the moment. One is you sort of centralise and lock everything down, or another one is about how do you make it more resilient, so it's sort of self-prepared, there's no single point of failure. It's not just happening in energy, it's happening in everything. The more you digitise it, expose everywhere, it flows up from behind people's meters from down the top. It's a really big issue, and I know board members on those companies that stay awake at night because they're the ones that are wearing the risk. And it's going to get worse before it gets better, if it will ever get better. So I think it's just a new, like change in the environment, the change in that digital environment is going to be just as fast.
For answering those final questions. There's a lot more people here who had questions, and a lot of questions that were sent in to me that could not be answered. I'm very sorry, but unfortunately time constraints means we cannot do that. But I do strongly encourage you guys to use Sway. QR codes are on your pay tables. You'll be able to ask those questions and discuss with experts or with other people around your queries. I'd like to now hand over to the MC, Abby, for the concluding remarks.
All right. So we'd like to thank you speakers for that really insightful discussion that I think has raised a lot of food for thought, and for so generously giving up your time and expertise, as well as to James for fulfilling an essential aspect of these dialogues, the moderation of difficult discussions. Let's show our sincere appreciation to all of these speakers. Now onto that platform Sway that Jack just brought up. Now that we are all thinking about the important subject addressed by our outstanding panel tonight, there is a unique opportunity to carry on the discussion with friends, family and colleagues, and online with others, using the powerful AI-guided one-to-one chat platform called Sway. So Sway matches guests with opposing or differing views and guides, prompts, steps in and informs as necessary. It could be likened to a marriage counsellor in difficult discussions. Sway is the creation of two academics at Carnegie Mellon University, one of whom, Simon Cullen, is a Melbourne University graduate. It only takes a few minutes to register, just a first name and email address, which is only used for admin. You'll be asked to rank your view on a few statements from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and then matched with someone to chat with. Or asked to play devil's advocate if there are too many people with similar views. You can chat when it suits you, just like SMS or WhatsApp, and it will be left running for about a week. A QR code and the link are on the pieces of paper on all your tables. If you have any questions, feel free to message that same phone number, Jack's phone number, on your tables. Also, if you want to actually talk to people in person now, don't miss the opportunity. Register later tonight or tomorrow so you can be matched up and start chatting. Finally, suggestions, offers, and proposals for more dialogue events are all appreciated. Email info@brisbanedialogues.org or contact Ormond through Jack's phone number. Everyone is welcome to continue mingling in the dining hall or in the vestibule out there until 10 p.m. when doors close. And if you'd like to exit the college and you can't see anyone to guide you through at the front gate, you can just press the buzzer at the front gate to exit. Thanks again to everybody for your contributions to this occasion and discussion tonight. Please carry it on at home, at work, or with friends, and online with someone on Sway. Travel safe and good night. Thank you.